Hello, Ethan. I'm going to be reading and responding to your paper one in this video. With all these amazing treasures behind me. Okay, the history of polio. Polio had devastated much of the 20th century. With the first U.S. polio epidemic occurring in 1894, polio was one of the most horrific diseases ever recorded and is caused by one of three types of poliovirus. The virus would spread through contact, such as nasal and oral secretions between people. Ew. It could also be transmitted through feces. Polio enters through the mouth and multiplies down the digestive tract. In most cases, about 98% of cases, polio is a mild illness with no symptoms or with viral-like symptoms. Wow, that sounds like a lot of what people talked about COVID. Okay, little thing there. So rather, what you've done is you've said in most cases, and then the quote has said about 98% of cases. So like when it's like directly repeats like that, it seems like it feels repetitive in a way that I think is not as smooth as it could be. So you could do something like experts believe that, quote, about 98% of in about 98% of cases, polio is something like that. Okay, however, 1 to 2% of people would be paralyzed and require artificial breathing support. In present time, polio has mostly been completely eradicated due to vaccines. It's mostly been completely. I think you gotta pick one or the other. Mostly been eradicated. Yeah, I know that there are like actual like official terms for this stuff because I've been. You're not the only person writing about vaccines right now. Imagine that. Okay, anyway. However, there's quite a bit of controversy correlated with the vaccine throughout the century. That's solid. Okay. During the first epidemic in 1894, people still did not understand what the virus was. 18 people had died, and 130 people had permanent paralysis. Okay, I'm just going to say something really jerk face because I can't stop myself. When you start a sentence with a number, you usually write out that number in letters, in words. Why did I even say that? It's just so not a big deal. But anyway, okay. I'm crazy. By the time 1908 rolled around, poliovirus was finally identified when researchers did spinal fluid taps and inserted it into animals and realized that it was smaller than bacteria. By it, I think you mean the virus. Inserted. They did spinal taps. Yeah, there's a little fix you need there because when you say they did spinal taps and inserted it sounds like they inserted the spinal tap, which isn't what you mean. There were many more epidemics throughout the country. Even FDR had fallen ill to polio. Oh, don't I know it. I have a picture and a bobblehead of FDR in my house. Sorry, he really throws me off track. Okay, had fallen ill to polio and was paralyzed below the waist for the rest of his life. However, many were not as lucky to be Many were not as lucky to just be paralyzed below the waist, and in 1929 the iron lung had surfaced. Surfaced? I think it was invented. Yeah, I think we need to be specific and say invented or... I mean, you could say appeared if you wanted to do something a little bit more flowery, but when we use the word surfaced, it just kind of takes me off track because then I start thinking about like, it showing up in a swamp or something, and then I'm like, that's not what we're talking about. I feel like this video is getting weird. Okay, these artificial lungs are the ones everyone has seen in history class, where a huge respirator would be placed in houses, and a patient's entire body would be placed in it for the rest of their lives. I know, it's so scary. Well, I guess sometimes it wasn't their whole lives, right? I don't know. Okay, these epidemics have continued to surface. Just polio epidemics had continued to surface. When in 1935 early polio vaccine trials had begun, there were two different researchers. However, both trials had become a disaster. I think you mean, there are two different researchers, and I think you mean both trials became a disaster. Because the way you have it set up now, this tense that we have in English, that had become, is suggesting to you that in 1935 they were already a disaster. And I think you mean that They began in 1935 and they became a disaster. And that sounds like weird, piddly stuff, but when we have like oddities in our verb tense, it often means that that like chronologically we've moved as writers, we've moved things around in a way that that we forgot we did, or and I would say like it is important. That's why I pointed out. Okay, the first trials had begun at New York University when a young researcher prepared a killed vaccine and tested it on himself, chimps, and children. Awesome. The second trial occurred at Temple University and was tested on 10,000 children. The test proved a disaster. Several subjects died of polio, and many were paralyzed, made ill, or suffered allergic reactions to the vaccine. Okay, so this quote is like sitting all by itself. It's just floating on its own little sentence island, and it needs to be hooked up to the rest of the paragraph. So how can we do that? Let's see. The second trial occurred at Temple University and was tested on 10,000 children. In your own words, you could say, the results were bad. And then start quoting, quote, several subjects died of polio and many were paralyzed, made ill, or suffered allergic reactions to the vaccines. Yes, that would work. But you pretty much never, I think I can almost say like never, when you have a quote from another source, will it be its own sentence just kind of sitting there, and then you'll just kind of walk away from it. You always need to both lead up to the quote, let your reader know there's about to be a quote, and then also explain a little bit about what that quote just said to connect it back into your work. So we talked about the setup, and then to connect it back to your work, you might say something like, this was really sad for everybody who had polio in 1935. Or, it can be something kind of obvious, but just to bring us back into following your train of thought. Because you're about to say morale had begun to fall until Salk began more early polio vaccine tests in 1952. You do have interesting verb tense stuff. Okay, morale had begun to fall. I don't think that's what you mean. I think you mean morale fell until Salk began more early polio vaccine tests in 1952. They had positive results, and vaccine recipients had produced antibodies to the virus. This came at a good time when polio cases were surging. I think I need a more connection between here's everything in 1935 and then we're moving now to 1952. That's a long period of time. I think you need some kind of transition sentence, because when you just say the morale had begun to fall and then we had this vaccine in 52, like that's a long time for morale to fall, without kind of explaining more about what happened in between there. Like, was everyone just dying of polio left and right? Okay, along with this many paralytic cases, we need to know where you got those numbers, 57,628. If you're not directly quoting them, that should be in parentheses to tell where you got it. Fears arose from parents and their fears arose from parents and there became. You mean they became more support and awareness? Oh, there became, okay, more support and awareness for a vaccine. That kind of there is the THERE. Like, there it is the THERE kind of there. Mass vaccinations trials had begun in 1954 with Salk's vaccine, and 1.3 million children had participated, half vaccinated and half controlled. However, at the time, this was just a trial, and they did not know if the vaccine worked. Well, that's what a trial is, right? So I don't think you need that sentence. The year later, the vaccine was proven 80 to 90% effective against paralytic polio. However, during all this time, there was an incident. Everyone marveled at the high success rate, some 60 to 70%, until the vaccine caused a sudden outbreak of some 200 cases. Okay, however, during all this, there was an incident. That beginning part doesn't go with your intro. Your intro, when you say during all of this, there was an incident, you're leading up to the vaccine caused a sudden outbreak. And if you want to use that other part about success rate, that should be somewhere else. In April 1955, just a few weeks after the success of the trials, an Idaho doctor had reported a case from a vaccinated female. Similar cases were reported over the next few weeks, and paralysis began in the arm instead of the legs. Oh, this error had occurred from the Cutler laboratories. The error had occurred from the laboratories. I think maybe you want to say the study took place, or the study was conducted at Cutter Labs. Around 200 cases of paralytic polio were recorded after a faulty batch of the vaccine where researchers forgot to deactivate the virus in the Cutter Labs ISC. This caused uproar in the community, and new safeguards were put into place to ensure another incident did not occur again. However, the damage was already done. Some locations would not provide vaccinations to the public due to risks, and many in the public did not want the vaccine. The polio virus has come down as one of humanity's greatest viruses. Greatest? I would say most dangerous. Along with Ebola and the Black Death. It has caused paralysis in many who were stuck in iron lungs for the rest of their life. I think you mean for the rest of their lives. It has plagued schools nationwide, causing hysteria for many parents to let their children go to school. I didn't know that. I mean, like, both my parents lived through this time, and they talked about swimming pools being closed, and about people being quarantined, but I don't think either of them had their schools closed. The nation had never seen an epidemic like this in modern time and was extremely unprepared. It was one of the first vaccinations known to man and came with considerable side effects. Over time, the polio what were the side effects? You haven't mentioned that at all. I mean, go ahead and tell us if you want to, but otherwise, like, that seems like a kind of big thing to dangle in here at the end. Over time, the polio vaccine was engineered properly and distributed to the masses and was considered eradicated by 1994. However, the damages to the Cutter incident would not be forgotten anytime soon, leading to the mass anti-vax population that still is a considerable issue today. Okay, let me take a look at your works cited. You only have 2 works cited! I think you're required to have 3. Let me see what is in them. Yeah, so you can also get more, add some more details to this by looking. I mean, it looks to me like you just have 2 like really general sources that are just like, you know, one of the early things that pops up on Google if you search polio vaccine. So if you get in a little deeper with one of these, I think that would also give your paper a little more depth and help you tweak some things. Like, I don't think you had to be in an iron lung for your whole life. I'm just saying that because I just recently heard a woman interviewed talking about being in an iron lung. I think it was the Supreme Court justice, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, thanks for your paper.